And we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the stream. Very excited for this one here. I, of course, am Nico from Nico's Book Reviews, and I am joined today by Liam from Liam's Lyceum, and, of course, the illustrious Howard Andrew Jones. I invited Liam to participate because a ton of the inspirations and things we'll probably talk about are a lot more in his wheelhouse than mine, and so he'll help out as my pocket sword and sorcery expert to help out with this as well. But Howard Andrew Jones is the author of quite a few things. Actually, he's got his Ringsworn trilogy, the new one, Lord of a Shattered Land. He's edited collections for some other authors, and I haven't read the original series, but that was Desert of Souls, I think.
Right.
I
Is
got
it
some
one as
other
well?
books here.
Oh, see,
So,
I sent my Ringsworn books to another booktuber after I finished them because I wanted to make sure he read them. So I'm like, I'm gonna send these to you. You need to read them. So I don't have them right now. But yeah, so that's a little bit there. But I'll let you guys introduce yourselves here. So Liam, I'll have you go ahead, and then we'll give Howard a few minutes to introduce himself as well.
okay, yeah. I'm Liam. I post videos at Liam's Lyceum, of course. I actually have some stories published as Liam Cutie Hall. I'm kind of like a sort of like sword and sorcery guy on BookTube, but Howard here is like, blow me out of the water as far as like any expertise would go. But I like reading sword and sorcery, and I like reading Howard Andrew Jones because those go hand in hand when you're reading contemporary sword and sorcery. So, yeah.
It's definitely. I remember the very first time I picked up the first book for The Killing of Kings, and immediately he's like, "Hey, that's sword and sorcery," because he was always telling me some things with it. So I remember that very well with it. But yeah, Howard, if you want to give us an introduction of yourself.
Oh my goodness. What do you want to know? So I've been writing for a very long time. Boy, that makes me sound older than I really am. Or maybe I am as old. Maybe I'm older than I like to think I am. So I've had a couple of series through St. Martin's. I had the Ringsworn trilogy, starting with For the Killing of Kings. And before that, I had the De Nassim novels, the first one of which is The Desert of Souls, which Liam held up. I've done 4 Pathfinder novels, which were a lot of fun as well. And then more recently, I've switched over to Bane. And the first book for the Lord of a Shattered Land just came out, goodness, last week. So it's pretty brand new. And it will be followed by 4 more books, is what I signed on for. So 5 total. But the next book, you only have to wait, 2 months. 2 months for The City of Marble and Blood. It'll be coming out in October. And I also edit the glorious Tales from the Magician's Skull for Goodman Games.
I am very excited for the next
The
book.
newest issue.
I was going to say, I figure you have one of those too. Yeah, I'm very excited for the next book in this one too. I'll definitely have to check out the earlier books because I just randomly found you from Ringsworn, saw the first book, and I'm like, this is cool. And then the art got super cool, especially the last one when the Goddess Awakes. One of my favorite covers of all time.
I love that cover.
So good. So good. When you have like a crazy dragon creature. See, this is why I should have made Andrew send me the copies back before the stream so I could hold them up.
That's the work of Lauren St. Ange.
It's some fantastic work for sure.
Yeah, she really knocked it out of the park.
Got Kayla and Kay so far. But some fun there. But yeah, so, and you mentioned some of your other books, and specifically with it. And I know I feel like we definitely should talk about some of the inspirations because you being very much into some like the old sword and sorcery and some of the even like kind of predating that with like historical fiction. And I know Howard Lamb is mentioned
Harold
specifically in the
Lamb.
new one too.
Harold Lamb.
Oh, Harold Lamb. Oh, I'm sorry. I can.
That's
Yeah.
okay. People sometimes call me Harold Jones and refer to him as Howard Lamb. So
I,
it's
you know, I had your name in my head. But yes, Harold Lamb, who is a historical fiction writer as well, and so you've got kind of a unique set of inspirations from what I've seen too, and kind of writing the style a little bit different. So I figure we can talk about that, and then Liam could probably help me out filling in the blanks on if he knows some of the writers better than I do.
Maybe.
sounds good.
So what would be like? What are some of the bigger ones, I guess, otherwise that we haven't talked about, and what stands out to you? What made you really want to do the kind of things that they did, or you do the style that you do?
Well, you mentioned Harold Lamb, and people on one of the discords I hang out on are always always laughing because I always end up talking to hey John, always end up talking about Harold Lamb. I chanced upon a history book by him when I was about 16 years old on Hannibal of Carthage, and it was so good. I read it multiple times, which is sort of weird, thinking about a kid reading a biography over and over. But I was just captivated by how Lamb portrayed the story of this brilliant general and his really patriotism for his country, and then the fact that the struggle was doomed and how it eventually fell apart, no matter how clever Hannibal was. And I liked it so much, I went out to the library and I began to seek out more books by Harold Lamb, hoping that he'd written more about Hannibal. And I was only, I was a teenager. I didn't realize that a Carthaginian would not be wielding a saber. So I picked up the collection, the curved saber, and that ended up being a whole bunch of wonderful swashbuckling historical adventures um, collected from Lamb's pulp days. And each one fits right into the one that came before it. So it almost reads like an episodic TV serial. Each one can stand alone, but characters return. Um, there's a couple of overarching secrets that slowly get revealed. I'm like, wow, this is some great stuff. And of course, by then it also been this was in the 70s, so the Dungeon Master's Guide had come out with its famous Appendix N. And if you're in the know, Appendix N was this master list at the back of the original Dungeons and Dragons that told about recommended reading. And so I took that list and I tried to go shopping, but keep in mind I was a kid, so I didn't have a whole lot of shopping cash. So the first stops were the library, and the second one was the used bookstore. And the library had almost nothing on the list except for Zelazny, and it didn't even have the first books of the Chronicles of Amber, which kind of sucks when you're trying to start a series. Fortunately, some friends did. But the used bookstore had what I still consider to be Fritz Leiber's best of the Lonkmar collections, which was Swords Against Death, and also had a slew of Moorcock. And at that point, I sucked all that down and I just loved it so much. I'd been primarily a space opera reader up until that point, and it kind of turned me straight over to swashbuckling stuff and sword and sorcery and historicals. And I've been there ever since. Although more recently, I've begun to read other historicals, like yeah, you don't normally think of a detective novel in the 30s as a historical, but it kind of is at this point, right? And Westerns are a genre all themselves, and I was never that interested in them until I found a couple of great Western writers, and they've informed the way I write about the wilderness and the management of horses and remote landscapes and things, because it feels so much more vital and real than the way a lot of fantasy writers write about this stuff.
Yeah, it's always interesting finding inspirations from sometimes things that aren't quite the same, uh, but make it kind of work. And I was going to say, from what you were talking about with Harold Lamb too, I can definitely see why Lord of a Shattered Land was dedicated to him. Definitely some notes there with like the Hannibal comparisons, although in the completely fantastical world. So pretty cool. I can also definitely relate with being a kid and the local library having like no selection of fantasy stuff. I mean, I read anything even remotely fantasy adjacent, but they would have like the most random things. Uh, but I ended up, when I was a kid, my library, when I started Wheel of Time, they had book one and they had book three, and that was it. And so I had them interlibrary loan every successive volume so I could read them over time. And it was like a whole thing because I'm like, I'm out of the fantasy section. I need something else. You guys don't have a lot. So
Yeah, it's changed so much in just the last few decades. I can wander in now, and there's more fantasy novels on the shelves than I could ever hope to read in my lifetime. But when I was a kid, wow, there wasn't much, and what there was wasn't the stuff on the Appendix N list.
that's probably a little more obscure, I'm guessing.
Right.
These days, I mean, I would say the Appendix N list is a great one. You know, just a great list to go and read. But I think it's interesting, Howard, that you kind of did like, I mean, you could say like a similar thing to Robert E. Howard, right? Where it's like he's taking inspiration from these westerns and historical stuff, and writing Sword and Sorcery, well, and other things too. But so. Yeah.
Well, I took an awful lot of inspiration from Robert E. Howard's writing, his propulsive pace, and his thrilling sense of adventure. My God, the way the guy writes action scenes. I gave up trying to write my action scenes like him because it's really hard to do. Scott Oden's the only one that sounds he sounds exactly like it. He can. I mean, he doesn't always, but when he wants to, he can. But anyway, yeah. But I didn't discover the wonder of Robert E. Howard's fiction until much later, and purely by coincidence, because that used bookstore did not have any Robert E. Howard, and the library sure as heck didn't have any Robert E. Howard. So it was actually a long while. I started seeing the Conan pastiche novels on the shelves of used bookstores, but not the original stuff. And since it was the pastiche, I'm like, well, some of those covers are sort of ridiculous looking, and it wasn't written by Robert E. Howard, and so I was kind of skeptical. And it turns out rightly so, because most of that pastiche, as it turns out, is pretty bad, although there are a couple of glorious ones. And I'm glad when I finally read Robert E. Howard, I read the real stuff first.
I totally because I have the Jordan ones that he wrote, and I'm like, I feel like I should read these first so that I don't hate them if I then go back and read the original Robert E. Howard ones, because I've heard that nothing compares to them by any means.
Well, they're of their time, so they've got some of the weaknesses of their time, but they also have strengths that sort of transcend time, as long as you're willing to see those strengths, including just incredible pacing and sense of wonder. And Conan's a lot more complex than he's given credit for, especially if you've only seen him on the screen, or if you're only used to seeing sort of knockoff Conans. There, where the assumption is that all barbarian fiction and all sword and sorcery has to be a guy in a fur diaper wielding a sword with a sexy babe strapped to his leg. You know, I mean, it's usually a lot more involved than that. But there's a lot of bad knockoff stuff that's what it is.
Yeah,
and I mean, there's some fun elements in that. I mean, Lynn Carter stuff is pretty much like that, and I dig Lynn Carter, but it's not. It's kind of one note, and I think today we want to see some people other than the protagonist with a little bit of agency, right?
yeah, definitely changes, but that's what is so interesting though about your books too, is because like Lord of a Shattered Land, this definitely reads like it could have been published decades ago and fit right in, but it also feels like it fits right in with our modern climate as well, because it has a lot of the sword and sorcery elements, and it has a lot of that kind of feel, and like it's very fast paced, very well developed characters. We look at others, and so it's interesting. It feels kind of like a throwback, but in a really good way. And I mean, with like Ringsworn, which had a lot of inspiration from Zelazny and Amber, where it still felt very current even with those elements. So do you like consciously try to balance the elements that you're pulling from other writers and other things from the past, and like trying to make it current, or is that just kind of the way it happens to come out?
Well, I guess I do in a way. I don't have like a list that I compare it to, but I always want my daughter and my wife to be able to read these and enjoy them. I'll never forget when I was a much younger man, my daughter came in. She was a becoming a big reader at the time. And she's like, "Oh, I'd love to read some of these great looking books here." And then I realized that there's so few empowered female characters in any of these books. Now there's a few, but it's a short list. And I'm like, I kind of swore then and there that there were always going to be powerful women in my fiction. And you guys have probably seen it. I think if you've read the Pathfinder novels, every single lead character, the main lead character in each of those books is female. And Elenai from the Ringsworn trilogy, uh, she's the main character. And there are, of course, other important female characters in there as well. And Hanavar, of course, is the main protagonist in this one. But we do see some empowered female characters with agency all through the books. And that's because I want my daughter and my wife and female readers to also find an imaginary escape and people they can root for. So yeah, I mean, I keep in mind modern readers, but some of it's my own. It's not just marketing, right? It's my own beliefs are in there as well. I like all of these aspects from the old sword and sorcery, but I don't like these. So I pull forward the stuff that I did love and leave some of some of the suspect stuff behind, the racism and the misogyny, for instance.
I mean, that's a good way to go about it and look at it. It's just like
Let's
I like these
avoid
things.
racism and misogyny. You know, I think that's
Those we can definitely leave behind. That's probably a good bet. So
Probably a good idea. No, and it works. And I don't know if like calling it like a deconstruction or a subversion, maybe those terms work. But I also like how in Lord of a Shadowed Land, it's kind of a revenge story, but at the same time, it's not at all, right? It's almost like a love revenge story or something like that. I mean, it works really well. It just kind of like in the first time also, I think in the first story when you see magic, I'm like, where's the dark evil sorcery? And it's not dark evil sorcery the first time you see magic. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool too. And then but most of the time afterward it kind of is. But so I don't know. I just like that wasn't like my expectations were like pleasantly met, you know what I mean? But like, oh, it's not written 100 years ago at the same time.
okay. Well, good. I'm glad I surprised you then.
it's I had a lot of fun with it. Like the way it first opened up too, I'm like, what on earth is going on here? Because the start of Lord of a Shattered Land is pretty crazy, and I'm like, I was immediately hooked because I'm like, all right, yeah, this was such an interesting start. But then it's as the further you kind of get into it, I feel like with Hanovar and the character and kind of the story, like Liam was saying, I feel like you expect a certain thing, and you don't really get that because it's more complicated than that. And as you get to know the character and get to know the story and really realize what's going on, you're like, oh, okay, I see where we're going. And so it does kind of present like it's gonna do some of those like big tropes and then subvert them handily, while also still giving you like some of the types of action and stories you expect, while making it still surprising and really really interesting character study of the character as well, which I appreciated going in.
Well, that makes me happy to hear. So when the first story started and it threw you off, what were you expecting? Were you wanting a more of a slow explanation of what was going on, or
So
how
for
do we
me
go?
personally, I just tend to go into things blind. And so I didn't really know what to expect. I was just kind of going off the cover and like the basic information from us talking about it. So I'm like, I'm excited. I'm not super well read in a lot of sword and sorcery, so I wasn't entirely sure. Although the format makes sense from what I see, but I was like, it was more so the plot of the what was happening. I really enjoyed it. It just kind of like it started so fast, and that was before I realized how incredibly quickly this story was going to be moving. So it wasn't like, oh, I didn't expect that. It was just like, holy crap, okay, what's going? Oh, now we're here. Okay, and it's just like immediately I'm like, okay, I'm here for this, but I just didn't know that it was going to be paced like that either, and so A lot of things kind of start off slow, and yeah, we're kind of figuring out what's going on. And this is just like, nope, he's here, he's washed up, now he's doing this. And I joked in my review that considering like this comes from like the first chapter on the cover, I'm like, that's crazy. You would think this would be like the last story. No, the first chapter has this cover in it, and yeah, so
Oh,
it just
this
pulled me in
delights
too
me.
fast.
This delights me because I mean, one of the things I never want to do again is have a slow paced novel. It drives me crazy. So the fact that you just immediately drop in and you go, and you're like, oh wow, it just drops and goes. Like yes, I mean it was designed to do that. So I'm glad it worked for you.
That's great. I know Nico. I know Nico likes his slow-paced novels.
We've discussed that. Yeah.
He's all about the slow burn or whatever. And I occasionally like a slow-paced novel too. Yeah, look at his bookshelf. But I always that's the thing that like really like. Well, Lord of Shadowland does a great job of it. But also when I first started reading Sword and Sorcery, like you mentioned earlier, Swords Against Death by Liber, and it's just like there's no exposition. You're just going in, like he's not telling you really anything. He's showing you everything, right? And there's a world there. There's a great story. Sorry about my kids. But it like drops you right in, and you're getting a great story. You're getting great characters, but it's not taking any amount of time basically to like get you there. You just start there.
And that's one of the things I love about the older adventure fiction and Sword and Sorcery. There's no ramp up. You don't have to wait for it to get interesting. Oh, I hear that after the first 100 pages, it gets really good. It's like, no, it just you just go. It's like when you start a TV show. Here's the character. They're probably already competent. We don't wait for the long, slow story to find out who they are or what they're doing. They're in the middle of an episode. They're in the middle of an adventure, and we're following them. And we figure out whether or not we should be rooting for them and what's going on as the story unfolds. And after we've seen a few of the episodes, we know who this character is, and we're probably rooting for him or her. And that's what I wanted to do. And of course, you get to know Hanavar the more time you spend with him, because he's not going to be really demonstrative about what he's feeling. We don't spend that much time in his head, although we do spend some. We have to sort of see who he is through what he does.
For sure. Yeah, and that's like this is because I'll say too, this book is what it's like around 500-ish pages.
I think that's about right. Yeah.
And it reads like it's maybe 300, like with the speed, because it's so easy to flow. The episodic nature, it's just like I felt like I was just flying through
That makes me happy.
constantly. Yeah, so I was reading it actually right at the end of last month, because I needed to finish that and one other book by the end of the month. And I was determined to have it done so I could get my review out right before release.
I appreciate
And I thought it was going to be hard, and I'm like, nope, this is the perfect book to have to really need to go through quickly, because I didn't even have to try. I just was like, I was flying through. I had so much fun with it, and yeah, the character too. And that's at first you don't really know what to think of the character Hanuvar, and that's where your mind just kind of fills in like, oh, so this is kind of the setup, so he's probably this type of character, or this is probably what the story is going to be about. But then you slowly get to actually know the character and see that, oh yeah, it's not that simple. And the kind of love revenge story, like Liam said, I mean it does make sense though, because love is kind of the driving force, other than revenge, even though you'd expect revenge. And it makes so much sense with the character too. It absolutely does.
Well, I'm glad. That makes me very happy. So for you guys, at least, it did what I wanted it to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
It kept you glued. You loved the character. It surprised you. It pulled you forward. That's great.
Yeah, I should probably check the chat here because I've been neglecting it for. Okay, really quick. So yeah, John, having that much fantasy is a good problem. It is, but I have so many things that I'm like, will I ever have enough time in my lifetime to read them? And yeah, probably not. Um, Robert E. Howard fan from James here. See, there's Andrew, who's got my Ringsworn books.
Hope you enjoy them.
I especially right after the first book, I just started ranting off. I see. There you go. That's I clicked without even looking. That's where
Those
like
Jordan Conan novels are, I don't know. I mean, there's some people who like the Roger Moore James Bond movies too, and they. I guess I still have a soft spot for Moonraker, but they're sort of ridiculous, and so are the Jordan Conan novels. And I know some people have a soft spot for them, and if they bring you joy, enjoy them.
I
But
only read the first one and it was a bit ridiculous. I still remember the ending. I couldn't believe he got away with writing that ending. I was just like, holy crap. Okay, that was unexpected, but
you
that was
made it
where
further than me. I didn't make it more than like 100 pages into it. It's like I can't do
uh,
this.
it was, yeah, it was interesting. That's why I haven't been back, so I might just end up doing the originals first. But that's where like I'm a fan of Jordan, so I wanted to give his a shot. But yeah, I that's where I, I've heard from a lot of people with comments like him. I'm pretty sure he's commented when I read it. He commented about not liking the Jordan one when we did review
Yeah,
too.
well, one of my good
It's been,
friends actually does like a couple of them himself, and he's a Conan pastiche writer. So there's 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 some good stuff in there. I just couldn't get. There's a couple of things he does that just drive me nuts, and I couldn't read
understandable.
anymore. Yeah,
We have Andrew thinking a fur diaper sounds comfortable.
I, yeah, I don't know. I imagine it would be really uncomfortable to swim in.
Have you seen, by the way? I guess speaking of this, it was the specific way. The was it breechcloth? That's not the word you used to describe it in Lord of the Shattered
Loin
Land.
clout.
Loin cloud. That's what it was. Yeah, somebody made a video specifically about
Oh,
that.
that was Jill
Uh,
Barup. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I was laughing so hard because I remember thinking the same thing, and I'm like, I mean, I'll believe that that is a correct thing with it. I didn't question it as much as she did,
Uh,
but I was laughing so much at her video for that. So that's what this made me think
Yeah,
of.
I'm pretty sure I got that off of Robert E. Howard. You read enough of these writers and you start absorbing their words and phrasings. But it might have been a historical fiction piece as well.
That could be. I mean, that's a completely legitimate word, so it does work. Um, John said, "Rescue behind enemy lines" story from Writer's Story. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can see that too. That makes a lot of sense. Um, Kind of just going and rescuing with the individual interactions and working on it. I can definitely see that too. And we got Derek Bailey in the house as well. And we have, oh, it's a good thing I started looking at the chat because Anita would yell at me if I don't, uh, if I don't keep track of the chat. So, and we had a lot of discussion about whether or not people are morning people, which most people are not.
yeah,
But thank you all for joining anyway.
I appreciate
Uh,
that.
I appreciate it here. So we have Hanovar versus Conan. Who wins? Both have a day to prep. I don't feel qualified to answer this question, so this one is all you got.
Liam, it's on you. I'd hate to see one of my very favorite characters go up against my very
Oh,
favorite of the characters I wrote. So
oh man, you give the burden to me. Well, this is a hard one actually, because um, I would say if it's like okay, with the prep that changes names. With like just like straight up like head to head, I mean like um, I could see Hannibal or Conan winning, but at the same time, it's like hard to see Conan really losing. And like the guy is like extremely larger than life, right? I mean, it's basically a demigod,
yeah,
right? But with prep, from reading Lord of the Shattered Land, Hannibal is pretty clever. He's very useful when it comes to preparation stuff. I mean, he was a general, makes sense to me. And I guess Conan was a general, of course, and a king, but I don't know. I might give it to Henovar with the day of prep, though. Honestly, so that's kind of up in the air. I mean, it might be just like how the dice come out, type of thing. So yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
hopefully they'd end up on the same side.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Preferably, right?
Yeah.
They definitely have some things in common, for sure. But I'm trying to. I compared Hanover reminded me of like a Conan with like a little bit of Waylander in there, from Gemmel, and some like a mix of some other things too because of his temperament and like his personality was just, it also made him very unique. And so like I'm like my mind is trying to find a mesh of other characters to compare him
Uh-huh.
to, but
Yeah.
he was different as well.
Reminded me some of Hanlon from David C. Smith's Sometime Lofty Towers. Just some. I mean, that's another great novel that Nico should read. I imagine Howard has
On
read,
my
but I'm
list.
not sure.
It's on my to read list. It's actually right back
darn,
here.
Howard, what the heck? No,
I hear amazing things about it, but I've been a little busy the last couple of years with. I don't know if you know, I was writing this Hanavar series and editing
What's
this
that?
magazine.
Anavar series.
I might have heard of those.
There's a big stack of Roman historicals behind me too. I mean, I've been reading Roman history for years, but to bring the period to life, I just threw myself into a whole bunch more Roman research. And one of the interesting things about when you're researching historical period is, of course, you have the contemporary sources, what translated, because my Latin is terrible anymore. I mean, I had a couple of years in high school, but anyway. So contemporary sources, and then you've got the overview sources like, oh, okay, this is what people were doing at these particular times. But then if you're reading a good historical novel, some of that stuff gets presented in ways that you didn't see or didn't anticipate, and additional little facts that all of your research might not have crop up. So yeah, I've been spending an awful lot of my reading time just on some really great historicals. And of course, since I'm not writing true historical fantasy, this is just fantasy informed by historical periods. I can pick and choose my favorite parts. But still, I wanted to get the sense for like, oh, well, what did the clothing look like? What kind of food did they eat? How did their conveyances work? I mean, I knew most of that stuff, but that's the sort of...
I hope you weren't reading too much Plutarch. I found him exceptionally dry, but I mean, if you enjoy him, that's nice, I guess. But I do like the historical fiction sometimes, like Sailor. I read one of his
Stephen Sailor, the Gordianus books.
Yeah, and
Simon Scarrow's books about the centurion. In his, he kind of advances through the ranks the way Hornblower advances through the ranks, except he advances through the Roman ranks.
Yeah, and then I've read some Rosemary Sutcliffe, who's kind of does some Roman stuff as well. So
I really enjoyed John Maddox Roberts' SPQR books, and of course he did some of my very favorite Conan pastiche as well.
Yeah,
I mean, this is why Liam is here. I have no idea what you guys are talking about at all. Not a clue, but.
Well, if you're ever going to read the Conan pastiche, John Max Roberts wrote 8 novels, and they're all good, but there's 4 of them. Yeah, I think 4 of them that I would put in the very best. And my very best list is a very short list. There's a whole lot of Conan pastiche, most of which is dreadful, and 4 of his are really good. So.
It'll be you two I go to for recommendations of this sort. Continue. So I'm adding you to the list. Liam's been on the hook for a while now for recommendations for this kind of thing, but I'll definitely add you too, because I'm always interested in trying out more stuff. And like I have some Fritz Leiber from Liam. So I have Swords Against Death, and the technically first book that everyone tells me I should not read first. In Faffer, and so I have that. I do have some more Cock and some Robert E. Howard. I just haven't gotten to it yet, and so working more. So looking at the chat, James, I think you just need to read Howard's stuff if you haven't already, because it's been agreeing with just everything. Oh, but only one thumbs up from But we got a very excited, which 4 Conan books are you talking about? So.
Well, I'm not wearing my glasses, so I can't see the bookshelf, which is on the far side of the room. But I tell you what, if you do a search for Goodman Games, Conan pastiche, and my name, there's an article I wrote there on the Goodman Games website that lists my very favorite Conan pastiche novels. So that ought to get you there. And of course, it's a very subjective opinion, but I explain why these are my best. And what the qualifications are. So
Fair enough. Fair enough. We also had, I need to mention the Cicero trilogy by Robert Harris.
I have heard very good things about that, and I haven't gotten to it yet. I've been reading about that period in through historical fiction writers, and Cicero appears again and again and again. And it's interesting how he's always portrayed slightly differently. So he turns up in the John Maddox Roberts SPQR books, which are mystery novels, and he also turns up in the Gordianus novels by Stephen Saylor, which are also mystery novels. And those are all during the final days of the Republic. So of course Cicero is very prominent, and you get a pretty good sense of his character through these depictions. But I'm very curious to read more about him through these Robert Harris novels, and I just haven't gotten to it yet.
There's so many books, so little time. So
Right.
that's just kind of how it goes. And then we had John saying, think that with enough time, Hanover will be a character other authors compare to him rather than comparing him to anyone else.
Well, that would be pretty swell. You know, your lips to God's ears. There you go.
It's definitely Hanover is such a strong character. I'm really excited to read more of his stuff, and I know we talked about it a little bit, but I love the way he's kind of like introduced over time with the in book setting of somebody who's traveling with him who wants to create a play or like a story about him, and so he's like desperately trying to learn more about this very private man. And it takes a while to sometimes crack the shell and get in there, but it's like you have you as the reader are kind of playing the same role because you're like, I want to find out more about you, and he's not necessarily going to tell you, but then you slowly find out more. So it made the whole setting, because you do have a setup where it's like a story being told way after the fact too, which I think works really well for this particular story.
I'm glad you like that. I mean, that's all intentional. I really am rebelling against the whole front loading of the backstory, that you have to know all the characters' back history before things get rolling. I've read wonderful stories for most of my life that don't do that. And while I do enjoy that from time to time, don't get me wrong. I mean, starting with Dickens, getting to know the character from a very young age and following them forward can be awesome. But lately it's been feeling in fantasy circles as though that's the only way to do it. And it used to be done in other ways. And I'm doing it, and I'm going back and doing it some of the ways that used to be done. And frankly, I'm having a heck of a lot of fun with it. So I'm just delighted that some readers are responding to it.
Yeah. Well, and it's like Liam commented too. I do love my slow, long books. Like I just recently finished reading all of the Wars in Light and Shadow books by Janie Words, which are like beautifully written. They're slower. It does pick up a ton once you get further. And I like a lot of other like the big series like that. And despite being like probably almost polar opposite of your style with Lord of the Shattered Land to that, it is kind of similar because with that story too, she's talked a lot about she'll tell you things, but you have to just read further to kind of figure out what the context is and what's actually going on. And so you just kind of have to trust the process and keep reading. And it's interesting seeing that because you don't see that as much. But like another recent read of mine, which isn't recent books, but the Rune Lords series by David Farland. There were a lot of things I'd been buddy reading that with somebody else, and there were a lot of things where I'm like, okay, are we going to get some explanation here early on? But we realize you just kind of have to trust that it will be relevant later, or you're going to get some explanation later, and you always do. And so it is kind of rewarding instead of getting everything right up front. But it's sometimes you just have to have that trust a little bit. But your book moves so quickly. I feel like I'm like, oh, I want to know about this. I'm like, okay, I'm finding out more about this right now. So it didn't even take that much patience or anything because we were just going with it.
Well, good. I'm glad it's working.
So I do want to mention as well. And I'm trying to think how if YouTube will yell at me if I curse, but in For the Killing of Kings, I want to talk about it because I loved the line so much. I could tell you, William, you know it's what I'm talking about. But it is what made me just like I started the book, and once I got to this part, I'm like, I'm gonna just binge this whole series because yes.
Is
Uh
it the bit where Kirkconnell starts to?
yeah, yeah. And so it's you have the scene where it's like they captured somebody and he's doing the whole, you know, the monologue, the tell so and so about this, you tell them that, and then we're doing that, and then we end it with you know, F it, I'll leave a note, and he just kills him, and I I lost it. I literally laughed out loud. I rarely laugh out loud from reading a book like that, but I just lost it. I started telling everybody about it because I'm like, that just it was such a fun moment. And even though like the later books uh, aren't as humorous because things are getting really serious and it makes sense, but there was still a couple more references to leaving a note, which just killed me. Even then, even if it wasn't done for comedy, it was just that little reference to it. And so, what made you want to do that? Was it just fun? Were you specifically trying to kind of lambaste the, you know, hero versus villain monologue? It is such a fun scene.
Kirkconnell is one of those characters who kind of writes himself. I didn't even see that coming. You know, I wrote that little monologue for him. I was like, you tell them this. I'm going to come for him. He's like, F it. I'm just going to leave a note, you know, and then he gets him. He's just so over the top. And yeah, what can I say? Every now and then you get a character who kind of writes himself, and he's that way. As Lyceum from the Desert of Souls is that way. Another character from Killing of Kings who's that way is the Kobalan, Ortok. Writing him was easy. Anytime I had him in a scene, it just flowed. It's like I don't know. Do I need to write a novel about Ortok? It was so simple because he was just. I knew exactly what he would say. I'd never like pause. Okay, how would he respond? No, Kirkconnell and Ortok every time just it flowed.
The audio is particularly fun for Ortak's parts.
Oh, really?
As well. I ended up doing a mix because the audio narration was really good, and so I was like reading some physically and doing some audio just because it was really fun. So it was pretty good. With just it's the specific voice. I don't even know how to describe it, but the specific voice that she did for it was just really fun.
I'm good. I'm glad to hear that. I thanked her. I heard the initial parts, and I got to tell you, once the story goes out there into the public, I really have a hard time looking at it again because I'll notice things.
Mm.
So, so I haven't listened to the audio all the way through, and I haven't cracked the book open again. So yeah, I'm glad that the audio was awesome. Like I said, I heard some of the initial stuff, and I was pretty pleased. Although I gather that Hearthstones is pronounced Hearthstones all the way through, which sort of made me blink. But you know, oh well.
Different pronunciation of the word there. Yes,
yeah.
You get that sometimes and sometimes maybe it's just a difference in, I guess, dialect, depending on where they're from. But other times I'm like, I'm pretty sure you just don't know how to pronounce that word occasionally. I've seen with people. So it is it's always interesting with it, but
yeah,
it was good performance though.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, yeah, I was impressed with her. I even thanked her in the acknowledgments.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, I did similar. I did some audio and some of the physical book, and yeah, the audio was good. And I do some of I feel like I'm the one who says words wrong sometimes, Nico, because I was listening to a book yesterday and they said wizened, and I always say the word wizened. You know, like wizened makes sense, right? Because we don't say wizered. You know, we say wizard. You know, so I mean, like, right? It's the same idea, right? So
well,
we
encounter these words we don't hear very often just on the printed page, and then we interpret them, and then we have it in our head, and then we say it out loud. You know, sometimes we'll have been using this word for years in our own head, and then we say it out loud in front of people, and they're like, no, it's actually this.
Yeah, all the time.
I was gonna say that is definitely a problem with reading a lot, especially reading a lot when you're younger and encountering stuff like that, because there are still probably a lot of things that like I have to actually force myself to say correctly. My favorite of just the random words is a word I had never heard out loud spoken. I just, read it in books, seen it on games, is inventory. I had seen that word written many times. And as a kid, my mind went inventory, is how I pronounced it, inventory, which I think sounds more fun, to be fair, to this day. But then I was in like high school the first time I actually heard somebody say inventory out loud. And I'm just like, like totally messed with me because it's not the most common word. But we were like doing inventory at the grocery store I worked at. And so I'm like, huh, okay. So you're definitely not alone. That's definitely happened to me plenty of time with character names as well too.
Oh,
All the
sure.
things that I read, because I never used to do audio until just recently. In the last couple of years, I've given it a shot. So like people yell at me if I pronounce names wrong, and I'm like, look, I read the books. I didn't listen to audio. I made up my own pronunciations. It's so hard to change those once they're
Oh, sure.
ingrained in your head. So
Yeah.
it's
I love how
way
the
it goes.
English say aluminum. They say aluminium,
Many.
and
Yeah.
I love that so much. I started using that around the house. Like, oh, hand me some of that aluminium foil, just to amuse my kids. But now it's like, I kind of like the sound of that better.
Yeah. And
Aluminium.
I think that was actually the reason we say it as aluminum in the United States, because there was a spelling error actually originally. I'm
Oh,
pretty sure
really?
we dropped that on accident.
Huh.
So, but sometimes audio narrators get names wrong as well, or they just say it weird. I mean, like I read a lot of Forgotten Realms fiction, and I was listening to one, and they were talking about Shadowdale, right? And she kept on saying Shatterdale, and I was like, what are you saying? Like, that is not what it is. I get a lot of confusion with like those R's as well, especially if it's like a British narrator, because they don't say their R's in a lot of places where in American English we would. And so I'm like, I don't know if this name has an R in it or not, because like it sounds like there'd be an R, but they have it like in English or whatever accent, and I'm like, I can't actually tell, so I need to go open the book real quick or something. But speaking of pronunciation, John mentions Cyprian here. Do you say that it's Cyprian or Cyprian? I was thinking, Latin Cyprian, like because you have, just your hard k sound,
Right.
classical.
I'm afraid I say Cyprian, but I'm not married to that one the way I am Volanus. I've heard a lot of weird pronunciations of Volanus, and it's Volanus,
Mhm.
and it's Antares.
Wow.
Most people get Antares as I envisioned it, but I wouldn't object to Cyprian being pronounced slightly differently. I've heard Scipio pronounced multiple ways, Scipio or
Right.
which always sounds a little bit weird to me, but
Right. Well, we say Cicero, right? Too, like we were talking earlier. We're not sitting here saying Cicero. I'm like, okay, well, I mean, we're not speaking Latin, obviously. So
right.
Let's just say I think that's about how I pronounced the names for sure. But so I'm thinking back. I'm like, sometimes too, my brain just has a way to pronounce it in my head, but that doesn't necessarily mean I know how to pronounce it out loud. So it's always the fun time when you're saying a character or a place that you've never said out loud before suddenly, and then you're like, wait, do I know how to pronounce this?
Oh, right. If
So
you're an English speaker and you're trying to read Russian literature, for instance, just tripping over those names because they're so unfamiliar to us. So what following up on John there, did you guys enjoy Cyprian when you finally got to meet him? I tried to layer in that Antares was curious about him, and he got mentioned a few times, but he finally turns up near the last 2/3 of the book.
hmm I was going to bring him up actually. I love his character actually. He was a pleasant surprise. In fact, the chapter where he's really introduced, I almost cried at a certain point. I was like,
Ah.
wow, this is awesome. So yeah. Anyways, yeah, job well done in writing him. So.
What part got you when you almost cried?
Just about the slaves and the Volani and stuff. So
Good deal.
yeah, I say it's harder to talk about that without spoilers, but
Mhm.
it was such a great dynamic, and it was another one of those layers that just added something that's not like the basic thing that you would expect.
Mhm.
It's not really what you would expect to be the dynamic between those two people. at all. And the way we're introduced to that character first in kind of their own context as well, and then we get a little bit of like the flashbacks and everything. It was great because we got both bits of context, and yeah, another really well written, and I love the interactions toward the end, trying to be as vague as possible. Sometimes I feel like I'm being so vague. I'm like, am I even speaking sense? But I don't want to spoil anything because the last few of the stories in here, I couldn't put it down, and so yeah, it's definitely good.
I'm glad to hear that. So is Cyprian your favorite of the guest star characters then?
Yeah, probably for me. There's a lot of really good ones though.
I should say it's hard.
Yeah, it's a hard choice, but that's probably my favorite, I guess. Yeah, if I had to choose one, sure.
And that's, I mean, I guess we're saying that Antares then is part of the regular cast. He's not really a guest star after a certain point.
Yeah.
Because
it would probably be him if we are considering him a guest.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think of the name, and it wasn't necessarily the character, it was the whole setup, but the in the villa with like the traps, that character that's kind of revealed. I loved the idea of that character.
You mean the one on the mountainside? Or do you mean the
when they're like invited to that manor to purchase a slave?
Yeah, the real horror.
Yeah,
yeah.
That one was definitely felt like it had the kind of like creature horror and stuff in it, which you definitely get a mix of that in here as well, for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed him. Did you guys have a favorite monster?
A certain mushroom being that I shouldn't talk too much about, probably for spoiler reasons, but very disturbing, very great. I mean, I like myself some mycelium horror, or whatever, I guess, if you want to call it that. And it's a little different from change. I mean, it's almost Clark Ashton Smith, right? He's more flowers, I guess, right? But like, just creepy as hell. So like, just that stuff creeps the crap out of me. I mean, so, yeah.
I'm glad that worked for you. I was talking with Logan Dustin Whitney on the Rogues in the House, and he said something about there not being any cosmic horror. I'm like, haven't you read that? Didn't you read the segment with the mushrooms, man? He said, oh well, it struck me differently. Like oh, okay, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but
I mean, there were a lot of really interesting different monsters throughout, but yeah, that particular being, like, I struggled to choose anything else because of like the very end, where I'm just like, holy crap, yeah, it was disturbing. And I mean, like, it started to really be, and that was the other thing too, because we've talked a few times about the very fast pace and kind of the episodic nature of Lord of a Shattered Land, but it also, like, the overall story arc is still very strong, and we very early on are introduced to some elements that come back in a big way at the end as well. Yeah, there were so many really interesting things with the different creatures, and it wasn't always like terrifying. Like, we had the bird too, which was an interesting passage there as well, even though it wasn't like a scary creature. It was still an interesting magical creature. So lots to choose from, for sure.
Yeah, or even like the Eldeva, which kind of reminded me of like a northern dragon kind of thing of sorts, right? Because I don't generally think of dragons in Rome and Carthage, right? I mean, and they're not. I mean, they're monsters, I guess. You know what I mean? They're different,
yeah.
right? And so
winged serpents.
Yeah. So.
Oh, cool. Yeah. How about a favorite villain aside from the monsters?
What's her face? If you can kind of call her a villain in the racing story with the horse races.
Oh, okay. Alaria?
Yeah, I thought she was very nuanced. I like her.
Oh, good.
So, yeah, that story itself was pretty fun. I think that was probably the funniest as well for me. So,
I'm glad you liked that. You know, I wanted them all to be different so that it's not just the same kind of story each time. I want when each story starts, first to see that there's a progression, that they're all interconnected, but second that you're never going to know when you start what kind of story you're going to get, so that it'll be a surprise. If it's all, oh, Hanavar tracks a monster to its lair and kills it, that would get pretty boring pretty fast in a 500-page book.
Yeah, and I like that. I mean, it's like that's one reason why I like Liber a lot, you know, because he's either super badass at times, he's hilarious at other times, or he's just very dark and creepy. Well, he can get really horny too, but that's not really one I really like, I guess, about the other three. Yeah. Anyways.
I think for me, because I was trying to think if there was a particular one, but the group of revenants in general, I really liked their parts of the story. And the chapter we were talking about with the horror elements, that particular one, I really enjoyed his interactions with Hanavar, like trying to figure out which one of them is an imposter. Basically, so I really enjoyed that. But then some of the later stories too, just kind of them and the way that they were acting and them searching and then getting to see the one that was by the mountainside too. I really liked getting to see all of that go on too. So they were probably, and there were so many. It's where with each one, it's kind of hard to pick because the other one that was super interesting was one of the very last stories in the mountains, and that villain was very cool as well. And so I'm once again being vague because I'm talking way later.
Maybe that was a terrible question because it's hard to talk about with any spoilers.
I was gonna say, I suppose we could spoil this far in, but I know we've got some people on who haven't read it, so I've been trying to be really careful with it. So because we've got I haven't checked back here, but James asked that says he hasn't read any of your stuff yet, Howard. And what do you suggest?
Start with Lord of a Shattered Land. Yeah. I mean, it just came out and the next one's coming in October. So if any of this sounds good, this is the place to start. This is the best writing I've done because it's the most recent. And also I think it's the most authentic to what I've always wanted to do. I just, when I went hunting for this next book contract, I said, I'm just going to do what I absolutely want to do. I guess I've done that all along, but this time it's just my pure love of sword and sorcery shines clear as day.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fantastic book, so I can definitely recommend starting there as well.
Yeah.
I think that works. And it's obviously a continuing story, but I feel like reading this book, you don't feel like you're left on a cliffhanger or anything. There's obviously still a lot going on, but it's still satisfying.
I tried to build, and I'm going to build each of them this way so that by the time you reach the end of the book, it feels like a season finale, a satisfying season finale, not a cliffhanger. So yeah, there's still stuff to resolve, but you've reached a nice stopping point.
Yeah, which is nice.
Yeah, I can recommend, of course, if the author recommends you start with one, then that's probably a good place to start. But I can recommend starting with that one as well. I mean, I want to read more by you, Howard. I mean, because I have this, I haven't read it yet. And there's another one, right? There's a sequel.
Yeah, The Bones of the Old Ones. And until recently, and until I got to Hanavar, The Bones of the Old Ones was my favorite of all of my books, actually.
Nice.
The Desert of Souls was the beginning. It's how the two buddies become brothers in all but blood. And then Bones of the Old Ones was going to be symptomatic. It represents what the rest of the books in the series were going to be like. But unfortunately, I guess the world wasn't ready for Arabian fantasy yet. I think I hit like 10 years too soon or something.
Which is crazy because Assassin's Creed was coming out like right then.
Right.
And this, I think I've read, it's a story of this duo in A Book of Blades, right?
Sure. Yeah. There's also like an ebook of their adventures. I think that only has 6. And then I've written probably 9 or 10 more, and I have outlines for others. And sooner or later, I need to write like 2 or 3 more and then put them into a collection. But again, you guys have probably noticed I've been busy writing this Hanavar thing. So
yeah.
I haven't found time to write any more De Beer and Nassim.
Yeah, and then I mentioned earlier I like reading Forgotten Realms stuff a lot, and so I need to check out your Pathfinder stuff. I was actually just talking with Steve Diamond yesterday about those, and just RPG fiction in general. Steve loves you, by the way. If it
Steve's
wasn't,
awesome.
yeah,
He's a great friend and an awesome guy.
yeah. Steve is great. I've met him at some conventions in Utah. So, but anyways, I see more of your books in my future beyond just Hanavar as well. So.
Well, I'm glad. I appreciate you exploring it. Keeping in mind that the Paizo books, of course, are written not with my magic system. That's a Pathfinder magic system, and the D&D style magic system is fun at the table, but I don't really enjoy it in my fiction. And the setting's not mine, and all of the like a million different sentient races. That's not my concept. So. But I did have fun writing them, and I really enjoyed working with the Paizo people. And I'm particularly proud of the second. So there's sequences of 2 books. So 2 of them are about one group of characters, 2 of them about a second group of characters. And I'm particularly proud of the second set, although my best friend says that the second of the first set is the best of them. So I don't know.
Sometimes it can be just who likes what better.
Right.
Can vary. But I have not read I haven't read any Pathfinder, I don't think. I've read some Forgotten Realms in general and like some Dragonlance and stuff, but I probably should explore some more of those too, but there are just so many, and that's where I haven't gotten there.
There's so many books. If I were to turn this laptop and show you my bookshelf, you would just see how many books I am waiting to read.
Yeah. It's a never-ending problem for sure.
I wish most of that RPG fiction hadn't been like killed. But anyways, that's a different topic.
Well, that's a different topic. Yeah, the whole when Hasbro got a hold of the license, they just killed the novel line, and there were so many popular and talented writers who were working in that line, and they just cut them loose because it didn't compare with what they were making on other projects because they didn't understand publishing, and it's a real shame. All we have left is Drist, and that's a good thing to have left. But there's some really talented writers who were cut adrift.
Yeah, and it's nice seeing some of them. Like I've read another book by Rosemary Jones that wasn't like Forgotten Realms, and Erin Evans has her new fantasy book out as well.
Erin Evans is a friend of mine. She's pretty impressive. She's really smart, very talented writer.
Yeah, I love her books. Everything I've read by her. So.
Yeah.
And we've got here, so John mentioned in my interview that dynamic between Hanuvar and Antires, usually a soldier and an actor writer, would not have much commonality. Hanuvar learns the value of Antires' skill set. Yeah, it was fun how like normally you would expect to like the soldier to be like teaching him how to survive, but then you have Antires like teaching him how to act so that he could go undercover, and that was a fun dynamic, especially early on. It's like, you need to be better. You're not a very good actor, and it's not what you would expect, but it makes so much sense, especially with a lot of things.
Yeah, Antires was like, you can't always pretend to be a former soldier, and Hanuvar is like, well, there's so many former soldiers wandering around the Empire. It's like, but you're gonna get noticed. You got to come up with some different backgrounds. So
yeah,
I had so much fun with their interaction. You're gonna see a whole lot more of the Revenants in book 2.
I was gonna say John's on Team Me, because that's what I said for that question. So that tells you how far behind on the chat I am. Because that's where we are at this point. And then we have the quote: "I love Revenants, and no matter what I do to them, I never feel guilty."
I don't think Hanuvar said that, but Howard probably said that. Those guys are like the Gestapo or the Stasi. They're terrible. And so if when they turn up, it's not like Hanuvar's. There's all sorts of nuanced Dervins that Hanuvar runs across, right? So it's not just this black and white dichotomy. Oh, these people are all terrible. No, there's a whole lot of nuance. But when it comes to the Revenants, man, those guys are just awful.
So here we have a fantastic comment from Michael K. I'm probably never going to eat mushrooms again after this book. I thankfully don't like mushrooms, so I'm safe. But this is a fair comment. This is a fair comment.
One of my favorite one of my favorite meals is is sort of a mushroom stew that my wife makes. So, but I know that I know that it doesn't come from the same place that where these mushrooms were sourced. So I'm okay. I'm glad that it affected you that way.
We had
That's probably why I don't eat mushrooms at all, anyways. Like stuff like that.
Okay.
So
they answered their own question too. So yes, it is the first of the Chronicles, but it's definitely something you can read and like this might have been before we talked about it again, but it feels like you're ending a season of television, so you get a good end there.
Yeah, no cliffhangers.
Yeah.
And even you don't even have to wait very long for book 2 because book 2 comes in October. So this year, October.
Yeah, and then are you working on 3 right now?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was revising. So I'm no longer drafting and I'm revising it. So I hope to have it turned over by the time book 2 releases. So this is going to be a steady supply of Hanavar stories until they make me stop.
Nice.
I'm having so much fun. They're gonna have to make me stop, I think.
Do you get like a deal for like 5 or something?
I got 5, and I'm really hoping for 7. So I hope lots of people buy the first one, so I can keep going just a little bit longer.
There you go, people. Go out and buy Lord of a Shattered Land, so we can keep getting more.
Yeah, it is just like a TV show. Then you just keep on wanting more until they cancel it for some reason, right?
Well, no, I have a definite endpoint. So so I'm revising 3, and I'm going to be turning that over in just another couple of months. And so then I start working on 4, and there's a point at book 4 where I have to decide whether or not I ended in at 5 or if I go on to 6, and then 7's sort of a different animal. It's related stories. So the whole cycle would conclude at 6 or 5, depending on what kind of green light I get.
Okay. Well, I don't have like Tony on speed dial or anything, so I can't help you there.
So we have. Oh, I'll click this one. So we just answered this question.
I'm sorry.
No, we're doing good. We're actually caught up mostly with the chat, but we ended up answering that. But they did just order the book, so that's mission accomplished. Right.
Oh, well,
there.
thank you.
And then we had Tevin Daniels asking, I think if you have Michael Moorcock's Elric books, I'm going to assume yes.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been reading Sword and Sorcery since I was not a little kid, since I was in junior high and high school. As a matter of fact, I think I was talking about reading Hannibal when I was 16. I'm pretty sure I had been reading Sword and Sorcery since, I must have been like 12 or 13 is when I first discovered. I started Moorcock with the Coram books, but then I had friends who had all the Elric stories up till then. I mean, there's been many more written in the last 35 years. So yeah. If you want to talk to someone about old school Sword and Sorcery who's read them all, I think I've read nearly everything. There's probably some really obscure stuff that I've never found, but I've even read a lot of the obscure stuff, most of which you don't want to read because
yes.
Oof. It feels like you've read some of that obscure stuff, maybe.
I try to steer away, but yeah, sure.
Right. Well, from the old stuff, there's not that much on the A shelf. So pretty quickly you go to the B shelf and the more derivative stuff. And then it's like, okay, I'm at this point, I'm just scrabbling. Now, some of that stuff is crazy fun, but there's not a whole lot more to it. And then some of it isn't much fun and it's kind of dreadful. So just trying to read nothing but old Sword and Sorcery, you're going to run through it pretty fast.
I gotcha.
And that's one of the reasons I turned over to the historical swashbucklers, because there's a whole lot of good historical swashbuckling fiction. The problem is a lot of people that clamor about historical fiction can't seem to tell what's good and what's just okay. And they love it all, which is fine. You know, some people love all fantasy. But if you're wanting to get just the good stuff, because there's so much to choose from, it can be hard to find consensus.
That's
interesting.
That's fair.
Yeah, I haven't read much of the historical like fiction, especially the older stuff, I guess, like adventure fiction. I guess you could call it. Because I've only read a little bit of the Harold Lamb stuff. I haven't read any of, is it Talbot Mundy? And I've enjoyed lots of what I've read of Broder, Arthur Gilchrist
Brodeur, yeah, Arthur
Yeah.
Gilchrist Brodeur, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what did you read? Did you read He Rules Who Can?
I haven't read that one yet.
That one's
but
awesome.
I've read In the Grip of the Minotaur and some of his Faded and Sarkomon stuff. Those books are expensive, though. He Rules Who Can normally is. So I'm just like, I'm waiting until I feel like I have enough money and I can get that because
they're
I really
on
like
sale.
everything.
Those are through what, Altus? They're on sale twice a year. There's always a summer sale and a winter sale, and everything's like 25% off.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So go for those. I wish that these names were more familiar. Unfortunately, they're not anymore. But I guess we should feel fortunate that we can even find it for decades. And we're talking not like 2 decades, we're talking like 6, 7 decades. A lot of this stuff was impossible to find because it had never been reprinted since its days in the pulps of the 20s and 30s. And this stuff was incredibly influential on the fantasy that followed because it has nearly everything in the fantasy except for magic that works and imaginary places. I mean, you've got the political intrigue, you've got the swashbuckling, you've got the driving action. You've got fantastical places, fantastically described, except that they really existed. And the best of these can still be read and enjoyed today.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to get you to put a list together at some point and do like Howard Andrew Jones top 10 recommendations to check out.
Well, it'd be my pleasure.
Well, I'll get my people in touch with your people.
Okay, all right. They're pretty busy, so I don't know if they'll be able to get back to you right away.
We do have, I'll click the one without rampant typos. It's high on my list to get to. This is what it looked like the first time. So I'm not sure what was happening there with Andrew. I have my list to get to. Yeah, I have, several times throughout and immediately after sent him long messages about why he needs to read this book. Andrew and I we talked about a ton of stuff, and so I've been like going like you got to read this. It's really good. And speaking of fantasy having a lot of different opinions, though, I can't stand Elric from Andrew, which is actually a good thing because I have his 2 collections right over here. Because of the fact that he stopped reading them. So it worked out in my favor.
It worked out for your favor.
Because those books were expensive new, and I didn't want to pay full price for them.
Elric was kind of meant as a response to Conan. It's sort of an inversion on Conan, right? So some of what you might be responding to are him taking the needle one direction, doing something different with it. But it might be just a matter of style, because his style is very distinctive. And Moorcock is capable of a variety of different kinds of styles, depending on what character he's writing about. So if you didn't respond to Elric, you might want to try some of his other stuff as well.
Yeah, I talked to Andrew about Elric. We were in a live stream about this. If I remember correctly, it's because he kind of comes off as like a whiny teenager or something too much.
He can whine. Yeah. If you enjoy the bit where Sam and Frodo are wandering endlessly through Mordor's rocks and worrying about the weight of the ring, it's kind of that level about the great burden that's being carried. I love the Lord of the Rings, but I generally skim that part anymore. Mordor's really boring to read descriptions about, and then I know that the ring burden is heavy, but I get tired of hearing about it. So
yeah,
fair enough.
But yeah, I can recommend Corum though. I haven't read much else for Moorcock.
That's the first stuff I read, and even though and I've reread the first 3, so there's actually 2 trilogies of Corum books by Moorcock. And I reread the second one several times when I was a young man before I had my hands on the first. They're a little bit repetitive in structure, but they're so delightful as far as their weird imagery and imagination and forward drive. Yeah. So if you want to try something different from him, don't go looking in for like really complex characters or societies. But if you want a really interesting fantasy journey that does weird things with some beautiful imagery and great action pieces, yeah. Don't you think it kind of feels like a wonderful little fable that where all the knots are tied in the end, and it yeah.
I love Corum. Corum is awesome. So
Yeah.
it's also badass at times too. So all right.
Yes.
I'll keep that one in mind too. So I'm really curious to try, just because I'm generally curious about a lot of the more classic or older stuff, and that's been ever since I've been reading fantasy. Like I'll read new stuff too, but it's always a goal for me. I want to check out all of the big names, and so that's where I started reading a lot of the series or books that were considered to be like the big series or the big thing. And I'm slowly getting through those, and I still have a lot of the kind of the older ones that I'm so interested to find. I'm just not super well read in that area yet. So I'm really excited to get some more of all that kind of stuff. So I have a lot to do. So yeah, I'll definitely that that list of yours, which John says we'll call Appendix H, which seems like a great name. We'll definitely, I don't know, we'll have to work on that, and I'll try and definitely get to some more of them.
You guys, he's not Sword and Sorcery, although he, technically he might have written the first Sword and Sorcery story. Have you guys read Lord Dunsany yet?
I've heard the name, but I have not read anything.
I've read some. I've read The King of Elfland's Daughter and The Fortress Unvanquished will say for Sakna. So
oh yeah. So this is the Millennium Press edition. It collects the first 6 of his short story collections, and I can't recommend them highly enough. They're all very short. They're not interconnected. I think there's like maybe one character who recurs, and they're these short gem-like stories overflowing with imagination. Picture a little bit like, how Neil Gaiman will write something and it just has so many ideas, and it's like, man, I could write an entire novel based on the idea that you just threw away and mentioned. Lord Dunsany's like that. He's also a little bit like Ray Bradbury, in that there's so many gem-like stories that are phenomenally imaginative, but it's almost all fantasy. And anyway, this volume here might be the best one to get, although unfortunately it may be out of print now. But maybe your library has it, or interlibrary loan, or I go to adall.com, which is like a master search list of used book services. And of course, there's also Project Gutenberg, which has all the contents that this has. And one of the things about reading a whole bunch of short stories is that if you come upon one that you don't like, it's over pretty quick, and then you just move on to the next one. Anyway, I can't recommend it enough. Like I said, it's not Sword and Sorcery, but I like stuff that's not Sword and Sorcery. For all my shouting about it, I read lots of other stuff. And if you're going to read about the roots of fantasy, this guy is really important, and he's worth reading. It's not just, oh, that was fascinating that this early progenitor of fantasy fiction had these influences, and you can read them because of these. Like, no, it's pretty darn. I mean, it's wonderful. So
yeah, no, I like Dunsany, so I'll second that. From the little bit I've read, you probably read way more than me. But I also like William Morris and stuff. He's kind of similar time period. He's not everyone's taste, I guess, too.
I'm afraid I bounced off of him. I tried him several times. I found his. But if you, I won't say anything more. I did not respond to him in the way I responded to Lord Dunsany. I remember there's even a poem Lovecraft wrote upon first discovering Dunsany. It basically blew his mind about how good it was and how vivid it was, filled his imagination. I can't quote the poem, but if you read that poem, you see like, wow, this really transported the guy.
We have lots of hot takes in the chat right now too, though. So don't worry about yours too much. As we had James coming in with, I can't stand Lord of the Rings, which is strong. I will say, and I've said it for years, the Lord of the Rings is, fantastic. It's obviously a masterpiece. It's like the most influential thing. But there are a lot of parts of it that are boring. There just are, to me, at least.
You don't like the poems?
So, okay.
You can't say.
I'm sorry, I skipped the poem.
But see, okay, and I haven't reread in a while, but I always I don't like skipping things, so I would always read the poems and I would read the songs, and so I had such a rough time with that because I'm like, I know I should have just skipped them, I know I should have, but I never did. I made myself read every line, and I'm not much better now. I'll kind of skim songs or like poems, but I still usually read
Well,
them. I
unfortunately,
can't help it.
this is now your thing, man. You have to read it all so you can communicate intelligently in reviews. You can't. If there's a boring poem, you've got to read it. I'm sorry.
Oof.
It's
We
like
don't.
it's like reading for a quiz later, you know?
Uh-huh. Yeah. I would never be found saying Tolkien's poetry is boring. Okay, guys. I was like, that's actually one of the reasons I like William Morris so much. I read the first book I read by him was The House of the Wolfians, and that book is like 80% in poetry, in verse. And I was like, well, this is awesome. So,
That one is supposed to be good, and unfortunately, I read some of the others that someone had told me were good, and I didn't grok them. But that one is supposed to be awesome. If I ever try him again, I'm going to try that.
Yes, it's a good one. It's more historical fiction rather than fantasy, but
yeah.
I have watched some of your poetry videos, Liam, to try and give it a shot because I will admit, like poetry and me have never gotten along particularly well for the most part.
Yeah.
So
I like
I'm
actual poetry that has a rhyme scheme and a meter. Not that there's anything wrong with free verse, but I read some of the modern free verse or listen to it. And it's like, well, I think it might take a little bit more effort to do it the old way because you have to follow these rules and you have to work really hard to make it fit the rules. I probably just ought to go out on the lawn and shout at those kids to get off my lawn because I'm so old fashioned. But
you're fine. No, it's fine. Okay, this is. Let's go. let me get out my humanities stuff I took in school. No, I can't stand like once you get to the modernist period, you get your poetry. I mean, it's fine when what's his face does it. I can't even remember his name right now. Elliot
Cummings.
I like Elliot, right?
Okay.
When he's like, okay, yeah, whatever, he can do it. And on occasion, other things are cool. I mean, because like Clark Ashton Smith sometimes does that as well, and I love Clark Ashton Smith poetry.
Well, you're saying that someone talented could do something with the form that you don't like and make it wonderful. Yeah. I concur.
Right. Yeah. But most of the poetry I read is like, this is dog crap. So like I like this is not poetry. And so I know, sorry, Nico. But
yeah, you're totally fine. Go for it.
It's just like, but it's the same idea. Like I agree. It's like it's funny because like when in class, people are like, oh, we're American. We should do this like that's European style poetry. It's like, no, that's English style poetry. You're speaking English. You should stick to it. You obviously don't understand the language you're speaking if you're saying this is poetry because that's garbage. Anyway, so.
No, this like I've said a couple times. This is 100% why I invited you because I love talking about the book and I love the conversation too. But I figured you guys would have a lot in common with a lot of the things that you've read, and so it made sense there with it. But I was just saying I can't add a whole lot to the poetry conversation, but it's fun hearing how like serious you guys are about it and like how strong your opinions are. So I do enjoy that. Speaking of strong opinions, I think this was about Elric. Is what he's talking about. So some strong opinions for sure. And then we have Naslip with Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. I still need to read the second trilogy, but loved the first trilogy. It's difficult at points for sure, but I did really love Thomas Covenant. And yeah, I rarely hear people talk about that. Granted, I can understand why people have trouble getting into the series for both the style and what happens.
I noped out of it 3 times because of that key scene early on. I don't know why younger people aren't reading older fantasy, but I can assume it's because there's a wealth of modern fantasy, and attitudes have changed pretty quickly, especially as far as the roles of women in fantasy. Even as recently as the Covenant books, there might have been some female characters with agency, but they didn't have as much agency as they have in modern fiction. So that may be part of the reason. I do feel like some really great stuff is being left by the wayside that may have flaws, but still has wonders. And I hate to think that it, like the historical fiction we were just talking about, is just going to end up getting lost and forgotten and no longer be accessible to people. But that may be what's going to happen.
I mean, you definitely do have changing thoughts, and I know there are a lot of people. The people who are really into modern fantasy tend to not like older, or even if it's new, if it's older style. You know, I've seen that a lot. There tends to be a gap, but you also have the people who love their older books and don't want to read anything new at all because they're like, it's not, my classic things that I love. So I really bridge both. I will say with Covenant, if you continue on, and like there's at least one very troubling scene in the second book too. I will completely admit, but like everything that happens does come back and is super relevant, and there is a reason for it. So the first book, I'm like, I don't know. The second book I thought was nearly perfect, barring that one troubling scene that I could have done without, and I felt was unnecessary. And then the third book, though, just kind of really brings it together. So
I've heard other people.
really
I've heard
good
other
one.
people I respect telling me that I should try to revisit it, and then I point to my wall of unread historicals
Yeah,
and westerns and say, well, maybe I'll get back to it.
very fair, very fair. James likes Timeless Covenant. I think this is saying Lord of the Rings is the exception of the older series that still gets attention. James said that Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft is what got him into fantasy. Makes sense, makes sense. More Lord of the Rings. Yeah. And I think that's fine too. Like beautiful books, not a lot of actions. So I'll
I
admit
keep
that
hearing that I
sometimes.
need to read Children of Huron and some of the stuff that's been released more recently by Tolkien, and it's on my massive TBR pile.
Yeah, Children of Huron is metal. That's probably the best way to describe it. So, yeah.
Well, I'm intrigued. I haven't read that either, so I always mean to get to some of those, but I never got through the Silmarillion. Because it just read kind of like a history book at the time. And I think I was reading it too soon after forcing myself through the 130-page appendix of Return of the King.
You read the appendix?
I did, because I don't like to skip things. And so I read it was 130 pages in the copy I was reading. And after that, I tried to read the Silmarillion, and I'm just like, no, my brain rebelled. We stopped, and I never went back to it. And so I definitely need to. But
I've seen people quoting it in threads on a Discord I frequent, the Whetstone Discord, and it's just beautiful. And I read it as a young man, and I think I forced myself all the way through because I was too young at that point to know that I didn't have to not finish a book. And I think that I might have been too young to appreciate it, or maybe I just read too much of it in a row because I didn't remember how beautiful the language was. Or maybe I was just too young and stupid to appreciate how beautiful the language was. So I joke about my TBR pile, but I really do want to get to the Children of Huron, and I want to at least try key sections of the Silmarillion. I might even read it out of order and skip the creation of the universe bits and get to the heroic parts that are apparently later in the text.
Yeah, Fingolfin and Morgoth. Ooh, yeah, right. Some good stuff there.
it's I think I might, because it has been probably, I mean, it's been over a decade since I last read Lord of the Rings. So I'm definitely due for a reread, and I might try the newer audiobooks because I've heard good things mostly. Some people hate them, but I've heard mostly good things about the Andy Serkis narrated ones. But I feel like listening to audio would help with the slow parts and the songs, with me not having to actually physically read those. But yeah, I'm definitely due, and I want to try some of the other stuff with it. But I do love the description, Liam, you gave of Children of Huron being metal, because I don't know if either one of you know this, but like 75% of black metal bands either are named after Tolkien or have strong Tolkien themes. And if you're not familiar with black metal, it's like that's like the really, just like crazy. They're usually singing about Satan or Tolkien Satan, like Morgoth and whatnot, and like that kind of thing. And it's so funny how many of these bands are Tolkien related at what they sing about with it. So it's always a fun thing.
Yeah, fantasy and metal are interesting. I would say even specifically sword and sorcery, even because excluding Tolkien, I think most of the fantasy stuff you get in metal music is sword and sorcery.
Right. And a whole bunch of sword and sorcery writers, especially, I mean, modern sword and sorcery writers are heavily into metal. I'm like the outlier because, I dig the Beatles, right? So
Nothing wrong with that.
they're my go-to band. So, but yeah, most of them are real metalheads.
As I say, I definitely am. And I actually am starting up Monday a series of videos about metal and fantasy books. So there's more coming, but that's where with like there's a ton just of Moorcock's stuff. There were so many bands, and he actually wrote
Gosh.
lyrics for some bands.
Yeah, he was.
He went on stage with Blue Oyster Cult.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so like he was super involved, and granted, that's not really metal, but in like rock and there's some metal involved too. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff. So it's an
So
interesting.
you gotta do a video. You gotta read Swords Against Death finally, Nico, and then listen to Swords Against Death by Colossus. So yeah.
Ooh, okay. That I'm gonna add that to my list because that is not on my list currently, and I have a huge list. I've gone down a rabbit hole. So I will. I've been meaning to read that for so long. So I'll add it here, but adding to here. All right, so we have Clark Ashton Smith. James is also in agreement. See, I feel like James, you were definitely the target audience for this stream. So you really need to read some Howard, because some Howard Andrew Jones, not Howard. We talked about last name Howard, but really need to read this stuff because you seem to be in like full agreement with almost everything. People just said it was great because they didn't want to see it's great. I feel like part of that is if you make yourself read it or read it very young, I can see that. But this is a good point, honestly. Covenant's pretty tame compared to a lot of the Grimdark movement, honestly. So this is true. And not Slip is a black metal fan. Well, see, that's controversial because black metal wasn't a thing when Venom was around. So people like to argue if they count or not as black metal, even though they're like the prototypical black metal band. But I don't even like black metal, but I don't know why I do.
you know an awful lot about a subject you don't like.
I like metal in general, and so I'm interested in stuff. And there's a lot of crazy history with black metal, but I have never been able to get into it. I can get close sometimes, but I've never quite gone all the way. HBL has influenced many bands. Yeah, that's Lovecraft there's a ton of Lovecraft there too. James is buying some of your books today. Good to hear. Good to hear. Awesome. And that was, that's was great. Venom had black metal, and that's kind of where it came from for sure. So, but I got to show off some metal knowledge that you guys don't have, since you guys have had a lot of this from sorcery, poetry, that kind of thing. You know, I got to validate myself on my shit. No, I'm kidding. Oh man, well, this has been a really great conversation because we've gone through so many different topics, and this is also why I like to keep these kind of casual conversations more so than like a very formal interview, just because it's really great just seeing where the conversation takes
where do you
here.
get your ideas? Yes, or
it's a really good accent. I can tell you've practiced that a lot.
Oh, yes. I used to interview people for the BBC. Yes.
Well, that's just, I feel like you got asked a lot of the same questions. And so, like, we started with kind of, what's, some of the inspirations, blah, 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 just to get you talking, and then we see where we go. And I feel like it's a lot more fun here to just kind of chat and talk. But I know we're reaching kind of the hour and a half mark. I usually try to not run super much longer than this here. So we can probably do a last call. Anybody has any questions in the chat here? And we'll try to start kind of wrapping up.
Want any, mushroom recipes or?
No thanks.
What's funny too is, and my wife isn't really into fantasy, so she won't read it, but she does love mushrooms. And we tried out a new restaurant not long ago all of it was mushroom themed. It was like a mushroom broth with mushrooms and like a mushroom tortellini and everything. And now I'm just thinking about mushroom. I'm like, no. we do have that slip of how often can we expect releases from Howard on this new series? One per year. Any idea? Well, book 2 comes out in just a couple of months. Any idea on the rest?
Well, I'm hoping it's going to be 2 a year. Like I said, I'm going to be revising. I'm revising book 3 right now. That's what I was doing right before the interview started. And I expect to be turning it over by the time book 2 comes out. So ideally, we'll see 2 a year until they make me stop. And they're going to have to
2
make
years
me
is
stop.
fantastic. So
The year is 2060, the 50th Manafar novel.
No, my God.
It
Yeah, I
is.
can't-
It
I'm not
has
gonna
just
do-
surpassed the Legend of Drizzt.
I'm not going to do that to him. Yeah, there's a definite endpoint. So it's going to be 2. It's going to be 2 a year, and eventually I will have to stop. And hopefully they'll let me take it as far as I want to take it. But yeah, I have so many ideas for the character that are already all written down. I mean, I have the basic arc figured out, and I have thumbnails for all of the important sequences. I'm sure I'll think of some more because there's a few blank spots. The further out I get, I have a few more blank spots. But yeah, you're not going to see me suddenly take a 10-year hiatus and try to figure out what to happen next. Yeah, right? No,
I'd say this felt like an appropriate time to put this comment up. So
that's not going to happen.
Oh man. Well, any final thoughts from Liam or from you, Howard, as we wrap things up?
It is. Thanks for inviting me, Nico. It's nice to talk to you, Howard. Finally, tell the skull I am not worthy of immolation quite yet.
I'll pass that along.
Yes, thank you.
He's a very good listener, so I'm sure. Well, I really appreciate chatting with you both, and I love that you love the book so much. So thank you for that, and for sharing that, and for helping spread the word.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully, we'll get some more people reading it too, as well as some of the other stuff too. And I'll definitely be checking out your earlier work as well, because I can definitely use some more Howard Andrew Jones books in my life. So
Well,
for
good,
sure.
good. It's always good news.
Hey, there we go. Found
Well,
a new
thank
author
you.
and bought a new book. That's
Thanks.
what we like to see for sure. So, all right. Well, yeah. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and all you watching, thanks for being here and keeping the chat lively. This was a particularly lively chat at points with some of the topics, but this has been such a fun, really expansive conversation. So I've had a great time. Appreciate everybody attending and or watching, commenting, that kind of thing. But we'll wrap it up here though. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you later with Appendix H, maybe.
Thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.